Eva had always been a skeptic. She didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything that went bump in the night. As a journalist in her late 20s, she had learned to approach every story with a healthy dose of skepticism, preferring to seek logical explanations over folklore and superstition. When her editor handed her an assignment to cover the strange happenings in Larkswood, a small, secluded town nestled on the edge of a vast ancient forest, she wasn't particularly thrilled. Sure, the town had a reputation for being mysterious, with stories of whispers in the trees and vanishing townsfolk, but Eva wasn't about to buy into such nonsense. She was determined to find the truth behind these tales and prove that there was always a rational explanation for everything. Eva's journey began on a crisp autumn morning. She boarded a bus to Larkswood, not knowing what to expect. The ride was long, the scenery gradually changing from city streets to rolling hills, and eventually to thick patches of forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. By the time she arrived in Larkswood, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the town. The streets were empty, the buildings quiet and weathered by time. Eva immediately felt the weight of the town's isolation, a place forgotten by the world, where the past lingered like the heavy mist that clung to the earth. Her first stop was the local inn, a small, dimly lit establishment that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Mrs. Fennell, the innkeeper, greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Larkswood," she said in a voice as soft as a whisper. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Eva nodded, feeling the strange unease that seemed to settle over her the moment she entered the town. Mrs. Fennell showed her to a small room on the second floor, its windows overlooking the dense forest that seemed to loom like an ancient guardian, watching over the town. Eva took a moment to unpack her things and settle in, then headed out into the streets, eager to get a sense of the town before dark. As she walked through Larkswood, she couldn't help but notice the way the locals avoided eye contact. The streets were sparsely populated, and those who were out and about seemed to hurry to their destinations, casting wary glances at her as if she were a stranger who didn't belong. At the small cafe in the town square, a group of older men sat at a table, their conversation low and cautious. As soon as Eva entered, they fell silent, their eyes briefly flicking to her before they resumed their murmurs. She overheard snippets of conversation, talk of the forest, of disappearances, of things that went bump in the night. At first, Eva assumed they were just indulging in idle gossip, but the weight of their words and the way their eyes darted nervously around the room made her wonder if there was more to the stories than she had initially thought. After a while, Eva decided to seek out someone who might be more willing to talk to her. She had heard whispers about Grayson, the local woodsman, a man who was said to know the forest better than anyone. Some said he was a recluse, while others claimed he was hiding secrets of his own. If there was anyone who could shed light on the truth behind the town's eerie reputation, it was him. Eva found his cabin on the outskirts of town, a modest, weather-beaten structure tucked beneath the canopy of trees. Grayson was outside, chopping wood with steady precision, his muscular arms moving rhythmically as he split the logs. When Eva approached him, he barely glanced up. "I don't talk to outsiders," he said in a gruff voice, his words sharp as the axe in his hands. Eva wasn't deterred. She had dealt with reluctant sources before. "I'm just trying to understand the history of this town," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "I'm writing a story, and I need the truth." Grayson paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on her face as if weighing her words. Finally, he put down the axe and wiped his brow. "The forest doesn't take kindly to people poking around in its business," he said, his voice softer now, though still tinged with caution. "But if you're set on it, I'll show you. But don't say I didn't warn you." Eva nodded eagerly, thrilled at the prospect of finally getting some answers, though a part of her wondered what she had just gotten herself into. The next morning, Grayson met Eva at the edge of the forest. The trees here were thick and ancient, their trunks twisted with age, their branches intertwined in a dense canopy that blocked out the sky above. The air was damp, the scent of moss and earth heavy in the atmosphere. As they stepped into the woods, the sounds of the town faded away, replaced by an eerie stillness. Grayson moved with practiced ease, his boots crunching softly on the forest floor, while Eva struggled to keep up. She felt a sense of foreboding creep over her, as if the forest itself was watching her every move. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees grew taller, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, casting strange shadows on the ground. "It's quiet here," Eva said, breaking the silence. "Too quiet." Grayson glanced at her, his eyes narrowing as if he had heard something she hadn't. "It's always quiet in the deeper parts of the woods," he replied. "The forest doesn't like to let outsiders in. It has its own rhythm, its own rules." As they continued walking, Eva began to hear strange sounds, faint rustling noises in the underbrush, the snap of twigs beneath unseen feet. She stopped and looked around, but there was nothing to see. The forest was still, yet somehow it felt alive in a way that unsettled her. After a long, silent walk, they arrived at a clearing deep within the woods. At the center of the clearing stood a large stone circle, half covered in moss and ivy. The stones were ancient, worn by time, but Eva could still make out strange carvings etched into their surfaces, symbols she couldn't understand. Grayson motioned toward the stones. "This is where it all started," he said. "The pact between the town and the forest. Long ago, they offered sacrifices to keep the forest content. It's the price they paid for the forest's protection. But the sacrifices stopped. The ritual was broken. And now the forest wants what it was promised." Eva's stomach tightened. "You mean people have been disappearing because of this ritual?" Grayson nodded grimly. "The forest has been reclaiming what it's owed. It doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive." Eva's mind raced as she tried to process what Grayson was saying. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. The whispers, the disappearances, the strange occurrences. All of it was tied to the forest in some way. But she couldn't quite bring herself to believe that an ancient pact was responsible. There had to be another explanation, one that made more sense. But the longer she stayed in the woods, the harder it became to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at her. It was as if something was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. That night, as Eva lay in her bed at the inn, she couldn't sleep. The whispers in the trees were louder now, drifting through the window and into her room like a soft, haunting melody. She tried to ignore them, telling herself they were just the wind. But the sound grew more distinct, more deliberate. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the faint murmur of voices, like an ancient conversation being held just beyond the reach of her understanding. She pulled the covers over her head, hoping to drown out the sound, but it only grew louder. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, she threw off the covers and rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Out in the woods, she saw something, lights flickering in the distance, like fireflies. But they weren't fireflies. They moved too erratically, too deliberately. Eva's breath caught in her throat as she realized they were moving toward her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a chorus of voices, beckoning her to come outside, to join them in the woods. Eva backed away from the window, her mind racing. She had to get to the bottom of this. There was something in the forest, something ancient, and it wanted her. The next day, Eva met with Clara, a childhood friend who had recently returned to Larkswood to care for her ailing mother. Clara was kind and warm, but when Eva mentioned the forest, her expression shifted. "Please, Eva," she said, her voice trembling. "I've seen what happens when people get too close to the woods. My mother, she disappeared, just like the others, and I don't want you to end up like her." Clara's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, but Eva couldn't stop now. The truth was just within reach. As the days went on, Eva's experiences became more unsettling. The whispers grew louder, more frequent, and the strange lights continued to appear in the forest, beckoning her toward them. Grayson's warnings echoed in her mind. The forest doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. But Eva couldn't bring herself to leave. She needed to know what had happened to the people who disappeared, what connection the forest had to the town's dark past. Then one day, while wandering deeper into the woods, Eva stumbled upon a hidden burial ground, its tombstones half buried beneath moss and ivy. Her heart sank as she saw one name carved into the stone, Clara's mother. But the date of death was recent. This wasn't just a memorial, it was a grave, and it was far too fresh. Clara's mother hadn't died. She had been taken by the forest. The realization hit Eva like a blow to the chest. With a sudden sense of clarity, Eva turned to Grayson. "It's not just a pact," she whispered. "The forest is alive. It's a living, breathing entity, and it wants to take more. It's not just the past, it's happening now." Grayson's face went pale as he nodded. "You understand now," he said quietly. "And now, the forest wants you too." Eva's legs trembled beneath her as she backed away. But it was too late. The whispers grew louder. The trees seemed to close in around her, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. She wasn't just in the forest anymore. She was part of it. The next morning, Eva was gone, and though the town searched for her, they never found a trace. But in the depths of the Whispering Woods, the wind carried the soft, haunting murmurs of her voice, calling out to anyone who dared to listen.